Okay, hopefully we're recording. Welcome, folks. Thanks for tuning in to this asynchronous PDW. Hopefully, as Mindy set the stage, we'll each speak for a brief few minutes with some stimulating, hopefully, morsels of sort of ideas for you to then run with and discuss in the discussion forum. So my topic today is creativity in organizations, and specifically in the context of the COVID crisis. I should say that I won't be addressing creativity's entanglements with capitalism or sort of capitalist ways of organizing, however much I am interested in that and do research in that. I won't discuss that today. However, there is some research that I'll flag at the end of this slide presentation that does touch upon that I've been involved with. What I would like to begin, or where rather I would like to begin, is something more, I think, benign and mainstream in the research, and that's around this topic of psychological safety. And I think we all are familiar with this term by now. It's certainly getting a lot of coverage, not just in mainstream research in organizational behavior and management, but also in trade literature. And we're finding that firms, Google, IDEO, are really sort of championing this term of psychological safety. And what we see in the context of COVID is this need for psychological safety emerging. And ironically, psychological safety has actually been increasing in the light of the COVID crisis. And that's been kind of like a silver lining. People seem to be spotlighting, hey, if we could really cling to anything in light of everything that's uncertain, perhaps we can really hold on to this increase in psychological safety that's emerging in organizations, right? And so, why is this happening? Again, I consider this surface level dynamics because we haven't quite got to the unconscious phenomena yet. But I think it's interesting to think through this at a surface level, right? So we have a crisis externally, and then within the organization, we have members expressing more vulnerability, perhaps fear, anxiety for the first time. And so that then allows for this idea of psychological safety to emerge, right? And the literature has proven through various empirical studies that when you increase psychological safety, one benefit or consequent dependent variable that increases is creative output. And so perhaps one could argue that COVID will lead, in virtue of this sort of mediating variable of psychological safety, to increased creativity. Now, how might we connect this to theorists within psychoanalysis that have something to say about creativity? And I don't have much time, so I want to spend just briefly discussing two theorists. On the left here, Melanie Klein, who's probably more familiar to most of us in the room, and on the right, Donald Winnicott. Now, obviously, both of these folks are very, very well known, but I think for Klein, why is she more familiar? Well, there's a direct sort of lineage we can trace from Klein through to Bion, through to the Tavistock tradition, Isabel Benzi's work and Jacques's work on social defenses. Winnicott has a lot to offer here too, and yet not really taken up as much in the organizational domain. So what do these two folks have to say? Well, one way to enter into this, connect this with psychological safety, is this idea of vulnerability and how creativity emerges out of this vulnerable space. And we have with Klein this idea of creativity emerging specifically out of the depressive position, and the idea that we can finally repair or make whole objects that were once previously torn apart or split, right? And projected outwards, right? So the bad object is split off and projected and sort of contained into an aspect of the organization that now can be reclaimed, repaired, And through that reparation, we then can actually see creativity emerge. And we have here a quote from a 1940 paper, Mourning and its relation to the manic depressive states. People take to painting, writing, or other productive activities under the stress or frustration of frustrations and hardships. Such enrichment is, in my view, gained through processes similar to those steps in mourning. Right? So we could think through, and this might be an interesting sort of area of future research, how psychological safety allows for this process of mourning to play out. And through that process of mourning, how this making whole of previous sort of split off parts of the organization can then allow for creative enactments or creative products. Juxtaposed with this idea of mourning and creativity, we have Winnicott's idea of creativity that is quite contrasting, despite both of these folks being within the object relations tradition, the British object relations tradition. And we have Winnicott offering what we could call a tantalizing view, to borrow his choice of words here. And let's just read his quote and then try to unpack what he's saying here. In a tantalizing way, many individuals have experienced just enough creative living to recognize that for most of their time, they are living uncreatively, as if caught up in the creativity of someone else or of a machine. So Winnicott really shifts our focus away from the internal object world to actual external objects. And that's a fundamental shift, specifically when we apply that to organizational life, because what he's trying to get us to do is think about how our creativity is contingent or dependent upon actual objects, not just the objects within that we hold in our minds that then somehow they're split and then they come together and merge and repair, but rather how the object becomes this foil. This external object is a foil with which we then use fully to instantiate the self. And through that instantiation of the self, we have this creative output. And so Winnicott, you know, as an individual was quite keen on this notion of sort of the true self and sort of bringing that to the fore and working through the compliant false self. And he found in Klein's work a lot of kind of latent compliance. Even within that mourning process of making whole, there's still this compliant sort of orientation to the world. And Winnicott tries to really break through that and uses this notion of ruthless creative destruction, how we're constantly destroying the object in our fantasy. And through that destruction, creativity can emerge, or this sort of instantiation of the self emerges. And just to give you a taste of Winnicott, you have this really beautiful quote, and it's often quoted. Hopefully you've seen it before, but if not, he talks about how this could be experienced phenomenologically. And we have here a great quote here. The subject says to the object, "I destroyed you," and the object is there to receive the communication. From now on, the subject says, "Hello, object, I destroyed you. I love you. You have value for me because of your survival of my destruction of you. While I am loving you, I am all the time destroying you in unconscious fantasy." And this is within his book, Playing and Reality, and specifically the chapter on creativity and its origins. So this hopefully gives us a sense of how to open up kind of the conversation around creativity in organizations in light of the current COVID crisis. We are in a state of flux. And we do, I think, require creative thinking and creative action. We can get there through both this Kleinian path of repair and mourning, but also through this more just sort of creative destructive path of Winnicott. And from an object relations perspective, we might want to ask how we relate to the organization as an object, both as an object within the mind and actually as an external object. And for Klein, I think the question that emerges is, can the organization remain whole through this process or this sort of time of flux? Can it remain whole and hold its various split off parts as one so that people can then go through a mourning process that leads to creativity? Alternatively, Winnicott would argue, or ask rather, will the organization survive our sort of unconscious need to destroy it? And through that destruction, so long as the organization can survive it, creativity emerges. Some further food for thought that might really kind of bring some sort of, meat to these ideas. We know that psychoanalysis has a lot to say about creativity, but we have yet to really delineate the different sort of lineages in psychoanalysis and what they have to say. That systematic kind of comparative work has yet to be done. What I have offered you is an object relations approach, but I believe that there are many others, right? Freud talks about sublimation, Lacan, who I don't, aspire to, be an expert in, I do think has a lot to say on this as well. So we have more to bring out in the discussion. Also, ideas are great, but how do we materialize this in actual processes and procedures within an organization? So we have these psychoanalytic precepts, maybe hypotheses, interpretations. What, as a practitioner, might we then be able to put in place to facilitate mourning as a creative process, or destruction as a creative process? And of course, how might all of this be done virtually, which is, the elephant in the room. We're currently enacting that right now. So thank you all for paying attention, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.